In this part, we're going to explain the details required for enabling Cassandra inside of a Spring Boot application. We'll start with the dependencies. Firstly, we're using the DataStax driver for Cassandra along with the Spring Boot Data Cassandra implementation. This is where we get our annotations for Spring Data from. Another requirement, at least in Spring Boot 3, is that you need to create your own Cassandra config by extending the abstract Cassandra configuration. You annotate it with configuration and specifically enabling the repositories. This is needed so that it can detect the various entity classes and repository classes for doing the interaction. Something else I've also found, I wasn't able to get the property files to work, so I had to hard code the name of the key space here, which you could also easily do by just referring to the property file. Relating to the property file, in here you specifically have to define these three attributes: the host, port, and the local data center to use. I was not able out of the box to get the schema creation working, and for some reason the key space name auto creation wasn't working as well. In terms of how to create an entity, at least one that maps to something inside a Cassandra table, I'm using a combination of the Spring data annotations with Longbach. The Spring annotations are things like table, saying, hey, this is the table, and I'm using primary key to notate that this UUID is the primary key of the table. However, because I wasn't able to get key space creation and automated table generation working, I wrote a script as a part of the setup when you're actually provisioning the infrastructure through Docker, which creates the actual key space and creates the actual table. In order to interact with an entity inside this Cassandra database, what you do is you use the Spring data repository annotation and create an interface that extends the Cassandra repository, telling it the entity that you're going to interface with and then the data type of the primary key. This is done so that whenever you want to interact with anything in this table, you inherit all these default methods for create, read, update, delete, and all sorts of different queries. When it comes to using the repository class created, you can use this in any service or component within Spring using AutoWire. AutoWire automatically instantiates the appropriate instance of the class in question so that you can interact with it without having to deal with setting it up. In this case, I've defined two methods that are interacting with this repository. The first one is for adding a generic record, where you see I'm calling the myEntityRepo class and save, and then also for just listing all the entities, where I'm just saying repository name.findAll. Both save and findAll are methods that are a part of the inherited interfaces and classes that I'm using. Also understand that when you're including a runtime dependency such as a database or any database, you have to consider how that's going to function inside of your integration test. That's because when you're writing an integration test, for example this one, that's using a Spring Boot test, it is actually starting up an actual Spring Boot container, which means it's going to be trying to auto-wire all of these various things in place. Now, because of this, you have two choices for how to deal with Cassandra. You can either use an embedded Cassandra as a part of your integration test, or you can disable it. In this case, I've chosen to disable it. And the way you do this is a few steps. The first step is, remember how I had that Cassandra config class? Inside my testing space, I created the same class name, but it's empty. This is a Java intricacy. But essentially, I have two classes of the same name on the same class path. And what ends up happening is that I'm actually overriding this Cassandra config with this one. So it's essentially disabling the Cassandra configuration. That by itself isn't enough. Additionally, as a part of my base integration test, I've specifically excluded the auto configuration of a couple of the Cassandra classes. But that also still isn't enough. If you leave it at this, you're going to get an error about some Cassandra template. So I used Mockito in order to mock my actual entity repository. And in doing this, that means if inside my integration test I want to actually interact with my repository, I have to use mocking.